Jonathan Martin, welcome to the Dispatch Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Well, let's start with your column this week, which has political media abuzz. The title of it was, "If Republicans Want to Win, They Need Trump to Lose." For the listeners who may not be familiar with the gist of the column, what exactly did the column say?
The best case scenario for the Republican Party's health is that Trump loses and loses decisively. It'll hasten the party going to rehab and starting to kick the Trump habit. Now, look, here's the challenge. A lot of the party doesn't want to go to rehab, all right? They like it. They if you want to change your metaphors, like the dogs like the Alpo. They don't want to eat anything else, all right? They want more Alpo, more cowbell, man. And so they don't want to give it up. But if he loses decisively, it makes it harder for him to do the same BS he did 4 years ago, stop the steal and all that. It is a sobering moment, for the non-MAGA crowd. They're going to have lost 2 presidentials in a row. They'll have not won a popular vote but one time since 1992. They'll probably lose the House, too, if the presidency goes down. And importantly, it sets the party up for a good midterm in 26. That 6-year itch we always hear about when the same party controls the White House for 6 years. They face a tough midterm usually. And then you potentially gives them the opportunity, and we can discuss this, to find a hybrid candidate in 28 that can play both ends of the piano, that can appeal to the MAGA crowd and the kind of pre-Trump crowd. Yes, a lot of possibilities, contingencies there, but it's just undeniable, at least with the non-MAGA crowd, that I think that's the best outcome to get the party back to a place where it can be a viable national party again.
Now, these insiders who speak to you, are they doing anything substantive to make what they're saying would be good for the party a reality?
No, of course not. They're just hiding behind anonymity and hoping that the bad man goes back under the bed here at some point. No, it's the same problem that they've had for 9 years. The leaders of the party can't stand Trump. They find him embarrassing. They're mad at their own voters, but like most of them don't dare say it, or if they do, they retire or they lose a primary. And so, no, it's the same problem as ever. And that's why I get the skepticism. Terry Sullivan, who ran Rubio's campaign in 2016, basically, we don't have a top of the ticket problem. We have a voter problem. Nobody wants to say that. That's in elected office, but that's the real challenge, right? The voters like Trump. A lot of them do, at least 2/3 of them do. And so, that's the issue. And the leaders don't want to transgress their voters.
It reminds me a little bit of all the articles we've seen over the last years of, anonymous senators, GOP senators saying Trump shouldn't do this, and then begging for his tweet. My question is always, why are they so scared? Why is losing an election the worst thing in the world to them? I mean, why are they so scared? Why be in office if you're afraid of your shadow?
Well, that's a whole different psychological question. But I mean, most of them want to stay in power because they like being in power. They want to win their reelection. Like, that's the most animating force for most politicians. But that has been the recurring theme. And look, the Republican Party had a great chance in January of 2021 to purge themselves of Mr. Trump. And, that was the best opportunity. And Mitch McConnell did not try to round up the votes to convict him of that second impeachment. The assumption in that moment was this guy is damaged goods and he'll go away. But he's not, because a lot of the voters still like him. And so that was their best shot, and they blew it.
Well, you bring up that's an interesting question for you then. You're right. The thought was, if we just call him the former guy instead of calling him Trump when he leaves, he's going to go and fade away. Does Mitch McConnell regret not doing what he could have done then? And
wouldn't you want to put him on truth serum and ask him? Exactly.
Well, you're in that world. Man. You know the people around him. Do people around him say that he regrets it?
I can't read his mind, but knowing his contempt for Donald Trump, I think at some point he will concede that was a missed opportunity. I don't know if he'll do that while he's still in office, but it's hard it's hard to think that he wouldn't recognize the mistake he made. Look, he thought Trump was done. I was in the Capitol on January 6th, and late that night, in fact, it was already January 7th by the time this happened, he came down from his office to leave, and I saw him and I talked to him that night. And this is in the book that Alex Burns and I wrote, which your listeners can still buy. This Will Not Pass on Amazon.com. And McConnell looked at me and he said that he felt what was the word he used? Almost exhilarated. How could you feel exhilarated? He said, because this guy put a gun to his head and he pulled the trigger, this guy being Trump. And McConnell was convinced that was it. It was Liberation Day. And he said, if he tries to play in the primaries in 22, we'll kick his ass. And that's not what happened. Trump didn't go away, and Trump got his way in the primaries in 2022 and rallied to a bunch of shitty candidates, and they lost a primary that was winnable. And then Trump got the nomination in 2024 and could blow a presidential campaign that is eminently winnable. So
now,
it was a critical mistake.
And now Mitch McConnell, of course, is endorsing him. It brings me to, I guess, the next question is, I always have to check my priors here because, what these insiders say is what I hope for too. I think that sounds like a potential. But what makes them so sure, just like they were sure Trump was going to fade away, what makes them so sure that the party will be less Trumpy if Trump loses instead of...
I don't think that there's any sort of delusion that it's going to be less Trumpy. I mean, I think the hope is just that Trump himself is not going to be the nominee at age 82 in 2028. But this actually, I put this in my piece, Jamie, because this is actually a robust debate behind the scenes, which is what's the better way to get Trump to the 19th hole and out of our lives? Is it that he loses decisively now, and we can start rebuilding, or actually is the better scenario that he wins because we know for sure that he then has to leave office in 28, and that's like a date certain when Trump will be out of our lives? Like, I know that argument sounds crazy to some of your listeners, but that's a real conversation happening in the Republican Party. How best to end the Trump era? A big loss now or a win so we know he leaves in 2028. But I don't think there's any thought among even the biggest RINO out there, even like Steve Hayes, for example. Steve, you listening to that? That like the party is going to go back to being like a Bushy, McCain, like party in 2020. Nobody thinks that, right? My sense is like the person that will succeed in 28, if the Republicans are to win the presidency, is he or she who can forge a coalition between the old party and the new party. And, I either come from one of those two wings or at least be able to fake it in one of those two wings, right?
Yeah, you write in the piece, the Republican who forges a hybrid coalition, a modern day conservative fusionism, harkening back to Buckley, Buckley's fusionism, between the pre-Trump party and his enthusiasts will be rewarded. No, it can't be anti-Trump, but it must be post-Trump.
Right.
Does that include, do you imagine, Bulwark readers and listeners coming back and joining this Republican Party? Is that possible? Is there a candidate that can unite disparate factions of the MAGA?
It's a really good question. Some of them are Democrats now, right? Some of them aren't coming back. And this is what happens over the course of like American political history is that, the Democrats who became so-called neoconservatives, speaking of the Bulwark, Bill Kristol's father, for example, a lot of that crowd, they were not going to become Democrats again. Like that was a realignment, and they left the party. You've seen this other times, like in American history as well, when the more liberal Republicans, in places like New England, couldn't stomach a person like Reagan, for example, too far to the right, like they weren't coming back, right? So I think some of them are gone for good. I do think others who are more traditional Republicans who just find Trump personally reprehensible will come back. And I do think that there will be robust arguments on national security, on economic policy. In some ways, Jamie, Trump, because of his persona, And because his conduct so swallows up everything, Trump is delaying an amazing story, an amazing debate. Trump is putting on hold this coming reckoning of like what the party stands for. Is it going to be a much more of a Wall Street Journal party? Free markets, free people, or is it going to be a more restrictionist, protectionist party? Isolationist party too. Like that's a really interesting debate. I just feel like that's on hold as long as everything's about Donald Trump talking about like blowjob jokes, right?
I mean, who do you? But speaking of the candidates, I'm thinking this through my mind as we talk. I don't. Obviously, Vance speaks to one wing. I think Haley speaks to a wing that a lot of MAGA won't
Never
get behind.
going there.
Is
Never going there.
Rubio the guy who's playing for both of that? Like,
You're not the first person who's mentioned his name to me. Could Rubio find a third act? Right?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question because he is the kind of hybrid figure. He's trying to become a hybrid figure right now. Does he have the chops to pull that off in 28? That's a really interesting test. He obviously comes from the more pre-Trump world, the more, Bushian world, but obviously has kind of reinvented himself. Could he appeal to both wings is going to be a fascinating test. What's interesting? If Trump does lose, I think we'll see the first shots of this this war fired when it comes to the Trump tax cuts and the reauthorization, because that's going to be the big ticket issue in 2025. If you have a Republican Senate and a President Harris, they're not getting a lot done. They'll fund the government. But what they got to do something on is not letting those tax cuts expire, because you're going to have an across the board tax increase. What does that compromise look like, Jamie? And we know damn well that a Senator J.D. Vance is going to be front and center in that debate. In a 51-49 or 52-48 Senate, he will be a key vote, because what he will say is, I'm not going to give you corporate America a dime of tax relief or anything on capital gains for you, investor, until I get my child tax credit plussed up to X number of dollars. And he will leverage that, and I think use that in the first sort of battle of this fight for what the party's going to be in the future.
I mean, speaking of Trump, because in this fight, if Trump loses, Trump is still alive, right? So what does his exile look like?
Too, right? Yeah, there's that. Right? No, it's a great question, right? Because as long as Trump is still in the picture, it's not like, I think I'll go ahead and call it a career and, play some golf, but kind of stay out of public affairs, be like Gerald Ford in Palm Springs, give a couple of speeches, but otherwise play 18 with a Bob Hope every day. Like that's not happening, right? I mean, he'll play golf still. It's Donald Trump, but there's no chance that Donald Trump disappears from the scene. And the question is, like, what form does that take? It's a really good question. He's going to be 80 years old in 2026. Trump is kind of ageless, but like at some point, even Trump going to start aging. What does that look like? Here's part of the issue. Let's say he loses narrowly this time around, like he did in 20, at least in the Electoral College. Does he keep open the idea of running again in 2028 for a couple of years? And does that torture the party, right? Because all these same figures we're talking about, these governors and senators who just desperately want to move on, are they going to still have to fake it in 25 and 26 and say, look, President Trump had some great ideas and policies, and we have to wait and see what he decides? Can you imagine, right? Oh my god!
What if he? I mean, do you think there's a chance he could run? I mean, what you say?
There is
a placeholder. He could run theoretically.
Biden ran. He was going to be 82. So why couldn't Trump? Right? Look, I think it would depend upon his fitness, quite literally. I think it would depend upon like how the party takes a defeat this fall. But he ain't going away. That's for sure.
Who do you think is the? I mean, assuming he doesn't run again in 28 if he loses. Obviously, J.D. Vance is up there because he's the VP. But who's fighting to be the Trump candidate? The number one Trump. I mean, is Trump going to anoint J.D. Vance, or could Tucker Carlson be the Trump candidate in 2028?
Well, this is where it gets fun, because the three people who were most instrumental in J.D. Vance being picked, Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr., and J.D. Vance himself, I think would all be interested in playing a central role in that very question of who is the Trump heir. Would one of them emerge? Are Tucker and Don gonna stick with JD as the heir apparent? Are they going to want it from themselves? I mean, it's a really interesting question. Is there somebody else beyond those three that we're not thinking about that would lay claim to that? It's not totally clear to me.
Here's the question I've always asked people, because people have widely different takes, political observers, on this question. Yeah. Can someone replace Trump? Is Trump a brand of personality, or is it issues that are motivating the voters to support him? Without Trump, could you go back to a pre-Trump Republican Party?
It's a good question. Look, nobody's going to replace the Trump persona. But obviously, the kind of populist, ass-kicking kind of affect, they'll try to mirror. It's not going to be the same because nobody's going to have the kind of like Catskills routine, on stage for an hour and a half up there talking about sharks and freaking laser beams, right? But somebody will try. I mean, again, I come back to this. Like, there's a really interesting policy debate that Trump's put on hold. And, how much interest is there actually in that kind of agenda? Which I guess gets to your question, Jamie, was like, how much interest is there in Trumpism among the actual voters versus Trump? And I think like that's not totally clear yet, right? I'll say this. I mean, not one sitting Republican member of the House or Senate lost a primary who voted for Ukraine aid. Now, if Trump had weaponized that issue and paid enough attention and had enough energy or curiosity to like pursue that, could he have ousted some incumbents over that? Like maybe, but it does get to the point of like, do you get in trouble for crossing Trump or Trumpism? And I think like right now it's Trump,
Speaking of J.D. Vance, I wonder if any of your sources are telling you anything about Trump's mood about the pick. Is he still happy with the pick? Does he think Don Jr. and Tucker, bamboozled him into a bad pick? What is he saying to Mar-a-Lago?
He doesn't like the bad coverage of J.D. Vance. He doesn't like the drip of like J.D. Vance said this 3 years ago on a podcast. Speaking of podcasts. And by the way, don't run for office, Jamie, because they're going to find something about you that you said at some point on a podcast, man. But it does show the perils of nominating somebody who basically, until like a half an hour ago, was like a guy popping off on TV and podcast, right? I mean, it's really incredible. But I think broadly, he likes the idea that Vance is like an ass kicker. He's, given no quarter to Democrats in the media, and is pretty confident and like polished on TV. Like that's the judgment Trump uses. Like, are you good on TV and in public appearances? And the answer is yes.
If talking to your sources, and just as you're an observer yourself, a longtime observer of politics, where do you think the race stands right now? Does any candidate have a clear advantage?
It's incredibly competitive because the country is as divided as we know it is. What we don't know is, do the polls still underrate Trump like they did in 16 or 20? We don't have an answer to that. So if you're going by the data as it is right now, then it's basically a toss-up with maybe a slight Harris advantage. But we don't know, right? Like the Trump polling advantage or disadvantage, I should say, was like really significant in 20, and he narrowly lost the race by 40,000 plus votes across 3 states. So like that's hard for me to reckon with are the polls still undercounting Trump's support because like a third of the country simply is checked out from major institutions and like won't take a pollster's call. Like that's a really sobering thing to consider. I will say this though, that Harris does put Democrats in contention in a way that Biden wasn't going to be able to. Biden was stuck with having to pull an inside straight by carrying the same 3 Midwestern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. She at least gives Democrats the possibility of finding an insurance policy in the Sun Belt because she can compete in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina. I'm not saying that she's going to win all 4 or even win 3 of the 4, but she can play there. So she at least gives them some breathing room. So if she can't put Pennsylvania over the top, well, maybe she can compensate for that by holding Nevada and holding Georgia.
You've done reporting on Joe Biden's exit from the race. Do you get a sense whether he still thinks he should be running? That he's mad that he thinks he could have won this race?
I think it'll take him a long time to get over his frustration, especially with Speaker Pelosi. There's a reason why he hasn't called her back. That is a really fresh wound for him. I think he feels, look, Biden's an old school, tactile politician, relationships and loyalties, everything to him. That's his world. And Pelosi was his Catholic sister, as he called her. And I think he feels betrayed. I think he is also a savvy enough politician to know that, like, Harris is, for at least like a month, done a pretty good job on this high wire, and she's now got a shot to win. But of course, I think he's frustrated and bitter about it, and it'll take him a while to get over it. I don't think we fully grasp what just took place. It's just an incredible story that one of our two political parties finally came to terms with the weakness of their own nominee, because that nominee called for a June debate and went out and had such a catastrophic performance that he got pushed off the ticket over the summer by his own leaders. It's really remarkable turn of events, and it does show, by the way, and I'm plagiarizing one of my own pieces that I wrote, just how Democrats, Jamie, have become a much more cold-blooded, top-down, ruthless, organized, hierarchical party. They're what the Republicans were always supposed to be, right? They're the James A. Baker III party, right? Or as I wrote, the Al Davis party. Just win, baby. I mean, they are so unified and consumed by Trump that, like, that's the order of the day. Sorry, Joe Biden, you had a good run for a half century, but you're going to lose. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. I mean, it's remarkable what they did. It shows the difference in the two parties. And look at Kamala Harris the last month. She saluting, brings in a handful of advisors from Obama world, runs precisely how prescribed. Oh, you were for single payer insurance in 2019 and de facto open borders? Sorry, you're now running toward the political center. Don't worry about that stuff. Here's how you got to run. And I'm like, nobody says boo in the party. She came out for less of a capital gains tax increase than Biden. You think anybody in the progressive caucus is like saying that that's a total sellout to like corporate America? Hell no. They want to win, right? It's just incredible how disciplined they've become and how Trump focuses the mind. What I wonder about, Jamie, is like the day after Trump, right? What do Democrats do the day after Trump? Because he is now the best force for organization they have, right? Like, he unifies the Bushes and the Cheneys in the same coalition with AOC and Bernie Sanders. Think about that.
Wow. It's a good point. And I do want to get to Kamala Harris, who you just mentioned. But you mentioned the June debate that Biden called for it. There is the theory that a lot of people around him wanted this debate to test him to see if he could do it, and it was so early. I mean, is there any truth to
Here we go.
People
I love
around
this
him
one,
doing that?
man. I get this question so many times when I talk to conservatives or speak to groups that include conservative folks. This is the favorite chestnut now. The Democrats' plot was they knew Biden was so infirm that they were going to push him off the deep end and expose him for all the world to see. And therefore, like, Nancy Pelosi would lead a 3-week-long campaign to get him off the ticket. And Biden would like play reluctant for a while, but eventually give in just in time for Kamala Harris to win the nomination by acclamation. I love it. Here's what I say. Like, no, politics isn't that organized. I mean, people aren't that organized. Like, look in your own life, America. Like, nobody has that level of sophistication or organization. Mediocrity is the rule of the day. It's always Veep. It's never House of Cards. Sorry, people. They're not that sophisticated, okay? The reason why the White House had that June debate is because he was losing in every survey for months to Trump, and Trump was not front and center. And the Democrats knew they had to do two things. They had to show voters that Biden still had it. He still had a fastball, which obviously that didn't work out so well. But they also wanted to get Trump by the lapels back center stage and show America that Trump was Trump. Do you want this guy back in your living room for 4 years, American voter? And I think they were so desperate because that debate in New York, that trial, Jamie, in New York in the spring had got such little traction, right? Here's Donald Trump on trial in New York City for paying off a porn star. And the American voter couldn't give two shits. It was not OJ. It wasn't even like the Kato Kalin trial. It was like a nothing trial, right? And Kristi Noem's dead dog got more like zeitgeist buzz than Donald Trump's trial. And so if you're the Biden White House, it's like, oh my God, how do we change this thing up? And they did that by calling for a June debate. Trump takes the bait, of course, because it's Trump. But no, the conspiracy wasn't there.
I think why it has some resonance, because there's still like some cognitive dissonance here, isn't there? That you have Joe Biden stepping down from the race, but not the presidency.
Right.
You have, reporting after Joe Biden steps down about, oh yeah, people noticed this, last year when he visited Congress and hasn't come, since he to meet with Congress since then.
Right.
People still are unsure of, okay, how bad is whatever we saw in the debate? How capable is Joe Biden of running the country? And if he has to step down from running for president, how can he be president? So I guess my question to you is, what is his actual state of ability?
Those are all fair questions. I just think like the idea that this was some like 7-point bank shot that was going to eventually force him out of the race, and that was conceived as such, just like gives these folks like way too much credit, and shows that people always want to believe that like politicians are like much more sophisticated actors than the reality, which is like they're barely putting their socks on every day. But as to Biden's condition, he's like a lot of people who are almost 82. He has like good days and not so good days. And that's precisely the problem. Is like, you can't run somebody for re-election who has good days and bad days. And it's why Democrats obviously finally had to do what they did. But like, look, this was always the issue, is that like the Fox News caricature of him as like drooling was totally unfair and not accurate. But the Democratic denialism of the fact that he had lost a step was also preposterous. And it's somewhere in between, like everything is, right? He's not what he was, but obviously he's still capable of doing the job, and knows the issues and can execute. But what he was not capable of doing was running the country and waging like a real campaign. And I wrote this last year that he wouldn't confront the age issue, and it was his biggest challenge, and he wouldn't confront it, and that like there was an obvious escape hatch after October the 7th last fall that Biden could have said, "Look, I need to be a father, I need to be a husband, I need to be a president, and I can't do all those things and also be a candidate." Right? There was an easy way out. There's so many times he had escape hatches or exit ramps, whatever metaphor you want to use. But he could have said something like that. And I'm going to be the best president possible, the best father possible for the remaining year of my term. And he could have done that and avoided the summer, humiliation that he suffered. And he didn't do it. And instead he got forced off.
Speaking of the vice president, what is her? Does she have an ideological core? It's a question that we've asked the last couple of weeks of guests. Does she have an ideological core? You mentioned how she's obviously shifted without really great explanation of those shifts. Yeah. Or is she a consummate politician that she'll go with the zeitgeist of the moment, whatever it takes to win?
Yes.
But what happens when she's in office? So where like when she's president, what actually is her
Here's the good news for your listeners who make a living as lobbyists and or consultants in Washington or state capitals or both. It's going to be a full employment economy next year, okay? No matter who wins, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, right? Because neither of these people is anchored in any real ideological project, right? Like, we know that about Trump. Like, let's look at the abortion issue. Like, Trump is for whatever gets him to win the election, and he's not committed to anything. Like, he hasn't thought about this stuff. He's not interested in this stuff. And Kamala Harris was like a fairly conventional California liberal, but mostly thought about law and order, justice issues, because that's the world that she came from. She hadn't given deep thought to foreign policy or economic policy really until she ran for the Senate in 2016. But even then, it's a Senate race in California. You're trying to win effectively in a one-party state. So, like, you get to where the left wants you to be, so you're not going to anger them, and you win the nomination. That's tantamount to election. And then she comes to the Senate, Jamie, and she's there for like a half an hour, right? Because she's sworn in January of 17. She launches her campaign for president in, I think, February of 19, and basically 2 years in the Senate. So you have a cup of coffee in the Senate, and she's still not developed a long, sort of sophisticated worldview. So yeah, we don't know how she's going to govern. She's going to be up for grabs. The combat next year under Trump or Harris in the agencies, in the West Wing, and on the Hill is going to be ferocious, right? Every week, there's going to be so much money, so many people trying to win the day, no matter if it's Trump or Harris. I mean, it is going to be remarkable to watch. I think in some ways be as interesting as the campaign itself.
Well, I mean, I read your Willie Brown column where you spoke to the one man that a lot of reporters want to speak to about the vice president, and he talking about himself as a politician was kind of transactional, saying that Donald Trump came to him because he was told that's where LA developers go to get things done. But
this is a great story. I have to take 30 seconds on this. Willie L. Brown, one of our greatest living Americans, the pride of Mineola, Texas, now 90 years young, still living in San Francisco, and still the man to see. Twice in the last year, I've had lunch with Willie Brown. Both days that morning, he had breakfast with a sitting member of Congress. It was Maxine Waters, one of his proteges. One day, the other day was Hakeem Jeffries, the man who would be Speaker of the House. So he's still in demand in California and beyond. It's extraordinary. So Willie Brown gets a call from Donald Trump out of the blue because Steve Wynn, of all people, the Las Vegas casino magnate, a friend of Trump's and friend of Willie Brown's, tells Trump, if you want to do any business in California, the guy you got to talk to who won't rip you off is Willie Brown. Now, Willie Brown is not a lobbyist at the time. Willie Brown is the Speaker of the State House. But he's still the man to see about doing business in California. And so Trump says, my buddy Steve Wynn told me to call you because I don't want to do a Trump hotel in downtown LA. Anyways, that was a sidebar. But it just shows like how small this world is. And it's also like good grist for the uniparty conspiracy folks that like nothing's on the level.
I mean, but
Jonathan,
what's relevant for the listeners who may not know, Willie Brown dated Kamala Harris for a moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a political mentor of hers and was critical to her rise because he introduced her to a lot of the swells in Pacific Heights. Yeah, no question about it.
But when you say she's, I mean, is that what Willie Brown's kind of view? She didn't go to Willie Brown and say, I care so much about this issue and that issue. I want to get into politics because of this. She just wanted to be in politics because power.
I think she has a center-left worldview. As somebody who grew up in California and college towns, she's not without definition. I don't think it's purely a play for power. Give her some credit, but no, it's not like a fully defined perspective, right? It's not Clintonism. It's not Reaganism. She's still up for grabs on a lot of economic and foreign policy. There's no question about it. But this is where the right, I think, kind of gets it wrong because they think like California liberals and the Gene Kirkpatrick, San Francisco liberals. It's more complicated. It's more of like a Silicon Valley vibe now. They're okay with capitalism out there, all right? Capitalism is okay in California these days. I mean, she's not a real lefty. She's somebody who's more up for grabs. Left of center broadly, but I think on the details still up for grabs in a lot of policies. And by the way, don't take my word for it. Like the first time she breaks from Biden, Jamie, since becoming the nominee, is on capital gains.
Yeah.
What a reveal that is.
It's a fair point. Let me get you out of here on these last two questions.
Make stock options great again.
Well, I mean, Mark Cuban's on TV campaigning for her, so I think he's won him over. If Biden's columnists, the columnists that he read every day are Tom Friedman and David Ignatius, kind of these old school figures, who are the columnists in the Kamala Harris White House that she'll read on a regular basis that might give us insight into who she is?
Oh, she and her husband are avid consumers of political news, and they read widely. And they read the good stuff and the bad stuff alike. I speak from personal experience, having covered her primary, her ill-fated primary in 2019, when I was at the Times. And yeah, both of them consume a lot of coverage of politics, and they're both pretty engaging people. And it's interesting, though, right? Because neither kind of were Washington figures. Doug Emhoff wasn't even a political figure. And Kamala Harris obviously was in the Senate, but like I said earlier, wasn't really around, right? And so I think like the last 4 years for both of them have been kind of a baptism by fire in Washington, and like they're still finding their way. She was really a throwback to an earlier model, Jamie, of VPs. Think about this: the last three VPs we had were Cheney, Biden, and Pence, who were kind of the like elders, at least when Washington applies, the elders in the relationship, tutoring the younger, more inexperienced president. Well, all of a sudden, we're back to an earlier model, and it's Bush Quayle all over again, right? And so I think like she is still finding her footings when it comes to things like foreign affairs and her worldview, but also like Washington and the press and that kind of thing too. So this is really a blank slate in a way that we haven't had for a really long time.
And finally, we're 60 days away. You've been following campaigns for a very long time.
Yeah.
What should our listeners be watching for in these final 60 days? What are you looking for that you think might change the race one way or
Don't
the other?
watch what they say, watch where they go. They vote with their feet. Where are Trump and Kamala Harris going? Where are they spending their money? Watch their money, watch their travels. Because if they stop going, look, if Kamala Harris decides Pennsylvania is never going to happen, she's just camping out in Georgia and in North Carolina for the back half of October, like that's a pretty telling thing, right? If Trump decides that Arizona and Nevada are gone and never really goes west of the Mississippi, except for Wisconsin, that's a tell. So I think watch those two things: watch their money, watch their travel.
Jonathan Martin, well, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. And Steve Hayes, I'm sorry I called you a RINO, brother.
Thank you, Jonathan.